On the morning of March 7, 1944, at exactly 0830 hours, Vice Admiral Jizaburō Ozawa stood alone on the bridge of the carrier Taihō, watching the sun rise over the calm waters of Lingga Roads off Sumatra. The light struck the steel around him in a way that made the ship seem almost alive, as if aware of the enormous weight of expectation resting upon it. Beneath his feet lay 32 months of work, 16,000 tons of steel, and what little remained of Japan's hope for naval parity. Taihō was the only purpose-built fleet carrier Japan had managed to complete since the war began. One carrier in nearly 3 years. Ozawa knew the numbers by heart, and yet they still didn't feel real. 3 days earlier, updated intelligence reports arrived from Tokyo. In that exact same span of time, the Americans had commissioned 17 new fleet carriers. 17. And that didn't include the dozens of smaller ones they no longer bothered counting. Ozawa read the figures again and again, hoping the numbers might rearrange themselves into something more reasonable. They never did. They violated everything he understood about shipbuilding, steel production, and construction timelines. Japan had spent decades perfecting carrier warfare, creating the most advanced carrier fleet in existence. The United States had supposedly started with almost nothing. And yet somehow, in less time than it took Japan to produce a single Taihō, American shipyards were producing new carriers faster than Japan could count them. And so, while warm sunlight washed over the decks, Ozawa already understood what that meant. The war was over. Not in the newspapers, not in the speeches, not in the minds of the Japanese government, but in reality, cold, mathematical reality, thousands of miles away in American shipyards lit by welding torches that never slept. Japan had entered the war with the strongest carrier force ever assembled, 6 modern fleet carriers and 2 light carriers, all tested in battle. The Americans had just 4. Japan had numerical superiority, tactical superiority, and more than 20 years of doctrine, training, and combat experience. Their pilots were the finest in the world. Their naval aviation had been forged through continuous operations in China. American aviators, by contrast, were inexperienced. Their doctrine was theoretical. On paper, Japan should have dominated carrier warfare for years. But paper lies. By December 1941, Japan already knew the truth. The United States had an industrial capacity 10 times larger than Japan's. Steel output, shipyard throughput, machine tools, production lines, every measure that mattered tilted impossibly toward the Americans. Admiral Yamamoto understood this better than anyone. He had studied in the United States, walked through American shipyards, and seen factories that dwarfed anything in Japan. He warned the High Command repeatedly. Japan could win battles for 6 months, perhaps a year, but beyond that, American industry would crush them. The government chose instead to believe in spirit over steel, courage over machinery, warrior culture over mathematics. They were wrong. Japan's first major loss came in May 1942, when the light carrier Shoho was sunk at the Coral Sea after taking staggering punishment from American aircraft. Her loss hurt, but she was only the beginning. A month later came Midway. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, lost in a single morning. Gone in 6 minutes of American dive bomber attacks. Those 4 ships represented 20 years of Japanese investment and over 250 aircraft. When the reports reached Tokyo, naval staff immediately began calculating replacement times. Akagi had taken 4 years to build. Kaga had taken 6. Soryu 3. Hiryu 4. Replacing all 4 would require 17 years of construction. Japan had only 3 shipyards capable of building fleet carriers, and all were already saturated producing destroyers, cruisers, submarines, and merchant ships. Dedicating them exclusively to carrier production for 6 straight years was impossible, and so a compromise was made. They would finish Taihō, already under construction. They would convert merchant hulls into light carriers. They would design a new, smaller class, the Unryu-class, that might be built more quickly. On paper, the plan was rational. In reality, it failed before it even began. Taihō's keel had been laid down in July 1941. She was launched in April 1943 and commissioned in March 1944, 32 months in total. That was very fast by Japanese standards. Yet when Ozawa looked at the intelligence files, he found the comparison that kept him awake at night. The Americans had laid down the carrier USS Essex in April 1941 and commissioned her only 20 months later. The Essex was larger, faster to build, carried more aircraft, and still took barely half the time. Worse, she was only the first of many. In 1943 alone, the Americans commissioned 11 Essex-class carriers. 11 in 1 year. Japan had commissioned 1. In early 1944, Japanese naval staff pored over the reports and assumed they had to be exaggerated. But reconnaissance flights confirmed them. Photographs confirmed them. Radio intercepts confirmed them. American shipyards were producing carriers at a rate that defied the laws of naval construction as Japan understood them. Task forces began appearing in the Pacific not with 3 or 4 carriers, but with 12, 15, even 18 carriers, larger than Japan's entire remaining fleet. Something impossible was happening, and Japan could not understand how. The answer began with a man named Henry Kaiser. Kaiser had never built a ship in his life before 1941. He built dams, massive concrete landmarks like Hoover Dam and Grand Coulee, projects that required moving mountains and managing tens of thousands of workers. When the U.S. Maritime Commission demanded thousands of cargo ships, traditional shipyards insisted that each would require 6 months. Kaiser disagreed. He saw ships not as ships, but as large steel structures that could be broken down into modules, built separately, then welded together. Riveters said welding was dangerous. They feared cracks spreading along a welded seam. Kaiser didn't care. He built 4 new shipyards, hired workers of every background, women, African Americans, people with no experience at all, and taught them single, repetitive tasks. Instead of building upward from a keel with craftsmen shaping each plate, Kaiser built entire modules in separate shops, deck sections, bulkheads, engine rooms. Workers welded them sideways, upside down, whichever orientation made the job easiest. Cranes then lowered completed modules into place like giant puzzle pieces. The first Liberty ship took 196 days. The 10th took 45 days. By 1943, Kaiser's yards were turning out ships in 42 days, with the record being 4.5 days. The impossible had become routine. Kaiser then applied the same ideas to escort carriers. No one believed it would work. Carriers were complex, delicate, technologically demanding. But in 1943, he proved them wrong when his yard launched Casablanca in 8 months, and then delivered 50 escort carriers in 14 months, 1 every 8 days. Tokyo dismissed these reports as errors, American bragging, or impossibilities. But at sea, American task forces kept growing. Now it wasn't just escort carriers. Fleet carriers were appearing at speeds that Japanese intelligence officers were running out of paper to record. At Newport News, one of America's premier shipyards, the Essex-class was being mass-produced using the same principles of modular construction. Welding replaced most riveting. Designs were standardized. Hull sections, flight decks, islands, all fabricated simultaneously in separate buildings. Flight deck modules over 100 feet long were built in 8 days. elevators assembled and tested before installation, propulsion modules, boilers, turbines, pipes, fully completed off-site, then lowered into place and connected. This turned months of labor into weeks. And so American carriers were going from keel to launch in as little as 6 to 8 months, completing entire ships in under 16 months. Japan could never match this. They lacked the industrial base for modular construction. They lacked steel. America produced 10 times more. They lacked machine tools, welding capacity, and the transportation infrastructure to move components quickly. American factories built standardized parts by the thousands. Japanese shipyards custom-fit each piece by hand because resources were too scarce to waste. American shipyards had 2 million workers. Japan had 300,000. Kaiser shipyards alone employed 90,000, more than all 3 major Japanese naval yards combined. And the American workforce grew more skilled each month because they specialized. A welder welded the same joint all day. A crane operator lifted the same type of module again and again. Repetition forged speed. Japan's craftsmen, brilliant as they were, had to do everything, which made progress slow. Even when Japan attempted mass production with the Unryu class, completing 3 carriers in 10 weeks, it didn't matter. In that same 10 weeks, the Americans commissioned 9 Essex-class carriers. Japan was sprinting while America had long since reached terminal velocity. Worse still, Japan ran out of engines, out of turbines, out of steel plate, out of fuel, out of shipyard machinery. Some carriers were finished using destroyer engines, too weak to reach fleet speeds. Others were completed without proper radar or with outdated equipment because newer systems were unavailable. And even if the hulls were finished, Japan lacked pilots. Before the war, pilots trained for 2 full years. By 1943, fuel shortages and losses forced training programs to shrink to 8 months, then 6. Men graduated with 1/5 the flight hours needed to survive modern air combat. Saburo Sakai, Japan's legendary ace, returned from combat to instruct and found chaos, overcrowded classes, rushed lessons, inadequate training, and no fuel for practice. Young pilots learned only the basics before being rushed onto carriers. They were brave, patriotic, and utterly unprepared. By June 1944, when Japan committed 9 carriers to the Battle of the Philippine Sea, including Taihō, they embarked only 450 aircraft, less than half their theoretical capacity. Many pilots had only a handful of carrier landings. In the skies above the Mariana Islands, they met American fighters flown by men with hundreds of hours of training, supported by radar, guided by veteran controllers, operating from a fleet of carriers that seemed to stretch to the horizon. 300 Japanese aircraft were shot down in a single day. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan called it the death of their naval air arm. And so on that warm March morning aboard Taihō, Ozawa watched the sun rise and understood the truth. It wasn't superior tactics or bravery or even battle outcomes that decided the Pacific War. It was steel output. It was welding torches. It was prefabrication, standardized parts, and millions of workers who never set foot on a battlefield. America fought with factories as much as with fleets, and in that arena, Japan never had a chance. Ozawa didn't know the exact details of how American shipyards worked, but he knew what the numbers meant. Japan's defeat had been written not in gunfire or torpedo wakes, but in industrial reports, shipyard quotas, and assembly lines stretching across an entire continent. The war would continue, men would fight and die, and battles would still rage across the Pacific. But the end had already been decided miles away in the glow of American foundries, long before the first shot was fired.